The moment he told her to sit down, the entire room forgot how to breathe, because no one in that luxury Manhattan restaurant had ever seen Billionaire so Richard Hale speak to his pregnant wife, Claire Hale, like she didn't matter. Yet there she stood under the crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes, one hand instinctively resting over her stomach, her eyes lowered not out of weakness but out of disbelief, while the soft hum of a $20,000 dinner service continued. Like nothing was wrong, forks tapping porcelain, glasses clinking, soft jazz floating through the air as if dignity itself had not just been stripped from the center table. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, his voice calm, but sharp enough to silence the room again, reminding Claire in front of investors, executives, and strangers that she should know her place. And in that moment something subtle but irreversible happened. The atmosphere changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a pressure drop before a storm. Every guest suddenly aware that they were witnessing something they should not be seeing. Claire didn't respond, not because she had nothing to say, but because every possible word felt too small for the weight of being publicly reduced by the man who once promised to protect her. Across the room, unnoticed at first, Jasmine Carter moved between tables balancing a tray of wine glasses, her steps quiet, controlled, trained by years of working in places where she was expected to disappear. She had seen powerful men before, heard cruel jokes disguised as confidence, watched silence used as a weapon. But something about this moment felt heavier, not just another insult, but a breaking point suspended in time. She paused near table 7, her eyes briefly shifting toward Claire, then to Richard, then to the still silent room that refused to intervene. No one spoke, not the investors, not the staff, not even the manager who stood frozen near the bar pretending to check a clipboard that no longer mattered. Richard's voice rose slightly again, not in anger, but in certainty, the kind that comes from a man who has never been questioned in his life, and that certainty is what finally broke something open in Jasmine's awareness. She slowly lowered the tray onto the nearest service table, the sound barely audible, yet somehow louder than everything else in the room. And for the first time since the evening began, she stopped being invisible. Claire's fingers tightened slightly, her breath uneven but restrained, while Richard continued speaking as if control still belonged entirely to him, unaware that the silence he had created was no longer obedience. It was anticipation, because something in the air had shifted toward an ending he could not see yet. Jasmine took one step forward, then another, crossing the invisible line between service and consequence, and every eye in the room began to follow her without understanding why. She was just a waitress to them, a detail in the background of wealth and power. But in the quiet geometry of that moment, she was the only person moving toward truth, and as she reached the edge of the table where Richard Hale sat convinced of his dominance, she stopped, looked directly at him, and what she was about to say would not raise her voice, but it would change the temperature of the entire room forever, and none of them were ready for what came next. The silence in the room did not break when Jasmine Carter stepped closer. It only deepened, as if every person present had suddenly realized they were no longer observers, but witnesses trapped inside a moment they could not exit. Richard Hale slowly turned his head toward her with the calm certainty of a man who had never been challenged in a space he controlled, his expression carrying the kind of detached patience that comes from years of being obeyed without question. Claire Hale remained still at the center table, her hands resting over her stomach, now slightly tighter than before, her breathing controlled but uneven, while the soft ambient music continued to play in the background, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge the fracture forming beneath it. Jasmine stood there without raising her voice, without theatrics, without urgency. Yet her presence cut through the atmosphere with a clarity that made several guests instinctively lower their eyes. She was dressed in a simple service uniform, holding nothing now, her hands empty but steady, and that contrast alone seemed to unsettle the balance of the room more than anything that had been said earlier. Richard finally spoke, his tone measured, almost conversational, as if addressing a minor inconvenience rather than a human being standing in front of him. He questioned why she was inserting herself into a matter that did not concern her, implying authority not through volume but through assumption, and for a brief moment no one moved, no one intervened, no one corrected him. Because in rooms like this, silence often learned to survive by agreeing. Claire looked down, not in defeat, but in emotional exhaustion, the kind that comes from being surrounded by voices, yet feeling completely unheard. And it was in that exact moment Jasmine's expression shifted, not into anger, not into confrontation, but into something far more deliberate, awareness. She glanced briefly around the room, taking in the investors who avoided eye contact, the staff who pretended to adjust settings, the manager who suddenly became fascinated by nothing in particular, and she understood with painful clarity that what was happening was not just between two people. It was being allowed by everyone present. Richard leaned slightly forward, reinforcing his control through proximity rather than force, reminding her indirectly that she was out of place in this conversation. Yet, Jasmine did not step back. Instead, she lowered her gaze briefly, as if organizing her thoughts with precision rather than emotion. And when she looked up again, the energy in the room subtly shifted, because there was no hesitation in her eyes anymore, only certainty shaped by observation. Claire finally looked at Jasmine for the first time, not as a server, but as someone standing at a threshold no one else had crossed. And in that shared silence between the two women, something unspoken passed. Understanding without words, recognition without introduction. Richard noticed the shift, but misread it as defiance, his voice tightening slightly as he reiterated his expectation that she return to her duties. But the authority he once carried so effortlessly now sounded heavier, less absolute, and for the first time it did not settle the room. It hovered, unstable, because Jasmine Carter was no longer simply present in the background of this evening. She was positioned at its center, and as she finally spoke again, her words measured and calm, they did not escalate the situation, they revealed it. And everyone in that room began to realize that what they thought was a private exchange was about to become something none of them would be able to ignore. The room did not move, yet everything inside it felt as if it had shifted slightly off balance, like a chandelier that had begun to sway without anyone noticing the first vibration. Jasmine Carter remained still for a brief moment after speaking, her posture calm but intentional, as though she understood that words once released could not be taken back, only carried forward. Richard Hale stared at her in silence, not because he lacked response, but because he was recalibrating the situation in real time, trying to place her within a structure that no longer seemed to fit his expectations. Claire Hale lifted her eyes slowly toward Jasmine, her expression carrying something between confusion and fragile hope, as if she had not been spoken for in a long time and was unsure whether she was allowed to respond to it. The surrounding guests remained frozen in place, their attention no longer on conversation or food, but on the unfolding tension at the center table, where status and silence were beginning to compete for control. Jasmine's voice, when it came again, was steady and measured, not raised, not emotional, but precise. And that precision made it more powerful than anything shouted earlier. She did not accuse, she did not provoke, she simply described what was visible to everyone yet acknowledged by no one. And in doing so she made the invisible structure of the room suddenly visible. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in discomfort, the kind that appears when control begins to feel questioned rather than accepted. He shifted in his seat, a small motion that carried more weight than words, signaling to those around him that authority was still present even if it felt momentarily challenged. But no one responded to that signal the way they normally would. The usual pattern of agreement did not follow, because something had already changed in how the room was listening. Claire's hand moved subtly away from her stomach, not in rejection but in instinctive self-awareness, as if she was no longer certain she was required to remain silent within her own life. Jasmine continued speaking, her tone consistent, each word placed carefully as if she had observed this kind of moment many times before but had finally chosen not to ignore it. She referenced the atmosphere, the reactions, the absence of intervention, not to shame anyone directly, but to highlight what silence had allowed to exist. And as she spoke, several guests began to look down, not out of guilt necessarily, but out of recognition that they had participated in something without realizing they were participating at all. Richard attempted to reassert control through composure, adjusting his tone to something more formal, more businesslike, as if returning the situation to a negotiation would restore its boundaries. But Jasmine did not step back. She simply listened to his attempt, and responded by staying grounded in observation rather than confrontation, and that difference made his usual authority less effective. Claire finally spoke softly, her voice uncertain but present, asking a question that was not directed at Richard, but at the reality she had been living inside. And that question lingered in the air longer than expected, because no one immediately answered it. Not because it lacked clarity, but because it required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was something the room had been avoiding. Jasmine turned slightly toward Claire, not as an employee, not as an outsider, but as someone acknowledging another person's humanity in real time. And in that small shift of attention, the entire dynamic of the table changed again, not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly, because what had begun as a private moment of control was now becoming something collective, something witnessed, and something no longer contained by silence. The shift in the room did not announce itself with sound. It arrived instead like a slow change in pressure that made breathing feel different without anyone being able to explain why. Richard Hale noticed it first in the smallest details, the way the nearby guests were no longer aligning their attention with him, the way conversations that should have remained silent had not resumed, the way even the staff no longer moved with the same rehearsed invisibility. Claire Hale stood quietly beside the table, her posture still composed but no longer folded inward, as if something inside her had begun to straighten after a long period of compression. Jasmine Carter remained where she was, not advancing, not retreating, simply present in a way that no longer allowed her to be ignored. And that presence itself had become disruptive in a room designed to maintain hierarchy without interruption. Richard adjusted his tone again, attempting to restore familiarity through authority, speaking as if structure alone could repair what perception had already altered. But the effect was no longer the same, because the room was no longer responding to structure, it was responding to awareness. Claire's voice came again, softer than before, but more certain, not directed at Richard alone this time, but at the situation itself. She questioned not only what had been said, but why it had been accepted for so long without interruption. And in asking that question, she exposed something deeper than conflict. She exposed normalization, the kind that grows when silence becomes routine. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not because they were being accused directly, but because they recognized fragments of themselves in what was being described. Jasmine finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, steady like a surface reflecting light without distortion. She did not escalate. She clarified. She did not attack. She observed, and in that observation she named what everyone had been avoiding. That power without accountability often survives not through force but through permission, and permission, once recognized, becomes difficult to unsee. Richard's expression tightened not in visible anger, but in the subtle discomfort of losing narrative control, the kind of discomfort that comes when the story you believed you were leading begins to be interpreted differently by those watching it unfold. He attempted to interrupt, to redirect attention back to status, back to business, back to the original frame of the evening, but the frame no longer held. Claire turned slightly toward him, not in confrontation but in recognition, as if she was seeing him from a distance she had not allowed herself before, and that distance revealed something unfamiliar in their dynamic. Not just disagreement, but imbalance that had gone unspoken. Jasmine's presence remained unchanged, yet the meaning of her presence had expanded. She was no longer merely a witness or an employee. She had become a reference point for everyone else in the room. A reminder that observation carries its own authority when silence is no longer neutral. The manager near the bar hesitated as if considering intervention but stopped short, aware that whatever authority he represented no longer felt absolute. The guests who had previously avoided eye contact now found themselves looking at each other instead, as if silently confirming that they were all part of the same unfolding realization. Richard finally stood slightly from his chair, not fully rising but enough to assert remaining dominance. Yet even that gesture felt less like control and more like resistance against something already in motion. Claire did not move away from the table. She remained grounded, her expression no longer purely uncertain, but increasingly reflective. And in that reflection, there was the beginning of separation between what had been accepted and what was now being questioned. Jasmine looked briefly at Claire again, and in that brief exchange there was no instruction, no direction, only acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement carried more weight than any command. Spoken earlier, because it confirmed what the room was now unable to return from. The understanding that silence had already been broken, not loudly, not violently, but completely, and what followed would no longer be about maintaining order, but about facing what that order had concealed. The air inside the restaurant felt heavier now, not because anything had physically changed, but because everyone inside it had begun to understand that something irreversible was unfolding in real time. Richard Hale remained half standing near the table, his posture still composed, but no longer effortless, as if he was holding together an image that no longer matched the atmosphere around him. Claire Hale did not move away from him, but she also no longer leaned toward him. Her presence at the table had shifted into something quieter and more self-contained, like she was beginning to observe the moment rather than endure it. Jasmine Carter stayed exactly where she was, her position unchanged, yet her influence expanding in ways that were not visible but deeply felt. The guests around the room no longer pretended to focus on their meals. Their attention had fully surrendered to the center of the space where silence had become the most dominant force. Richard finally spoke again, his voice carefully controlled, attempting to reintroduce order through familiarity. He referenced professionalism, discretion, and the importance of context, but each word sounded less like authority and more like reconstruction, as if he was trying to rebuild a structure that had already been dismantled in perception. Claire turned her head slightly toward him when he spoke, not reacting emotionally but studying him with a clarity that had not been present before, and in that clarity there was a quiet realization forming, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like something finally being seen without distortion. Jasmine listened without interruption, allowing the words to exist fully before responding, and when she finally spoke, she did not challenge him directly. She redirected the meaning of the entire situation. She spoke about presence, about how people occupy space without being acknowledged, and how acknowledgement is often mistaken for authority when it is simply permission, granted by silence. The room reacted not with sound but with stillness, because what she was describing was not abstract, it was visible in every person present. Richard's jaw tightened slightly as he tried to regain narrative control, reminding everyone indirectly of hierarchy, influence, and consequence. But the response he expected did not arrive. Instead, there was hesitation, not obedience. Claire's gaze lowered briefly toward the table, then lifted again, and in that small movement there was a shift that even she seemed to recognize internally. Jasmine's presence remained calm, but her words now carried a weight that did not require repetition, because they were being understood rather than processed. One of the investors shifted uncomfortably in their seat, not because they were involved directly, but because they recognized the structure being described and could no longer separate themselves from it entirely. Richard attempted once more to reframe the evening as a misunderstanding, but the phrase landed without impact, as if the room had collectively moved beyond the point where framing mattered. Claire finally spoke again, her voice steady but no longer deferential. She questioned not the moment but the pattern, not the event but the repetition of moments like it. And in doing so she introduced something that had been absent from the table until now. Continuity. Jasmine turned her attention slightly toward Claire, acknowledging her not as an extension of anyone else, but as an individual arriving at her own realization. And that acknowledgement subtly changed Claire's posture again, not physically dramatically, but internally, as if she was no longer positioned within the story but beginning to observe it from within and outside at the same time. Richard looked between them, no longer fully anchored in his previous certainty, and for the first time his silence did not feel like control but like recalculation, because the room was no longer responding to his presence in the way it used to. It was responding to something else entirely, something that could not be commanded or dismissed. And as Jasmine stood there in steady, quiet confidence, it became clear that whatever was going to happen next would not be decided by authority, but by what the room was finally willing to recognize. The atmosphere no longer resembled the beginning of the evening, not in tone, not in rhythm, and not in the invisible structure that once made everyone behave as if they were part of a carefully controlled performance. Richard Hale now stood fully upright, but the confidence that once defined his presence no longer translated into influence over the room. Instead, it felt like a man trying to maintain balance on a floor that had subtly tilted beneath him. Claire Hale remained seated, yet her posture had changed again, no longer folded inward, no longer purely reactive, but observant in a way that suggested she was beginning to separate herself from the emotional gravity she had been held under. Jasmine Carter stayed composed, her expression steady, her presence unchanged, but the effect she had on the room had multiplied quietly, not through force, but through recognition spreading from person to person without permission. Richard attempted once more to anchor the moment back into structure, speaking about respect, misunderstanding, and context, but his words no longer carried the same weight because the audience for them had changed. They were no longer being received as final statements, only as attempts to preserve something that was already dissolving. Claire finally spoke again, her voice soft but unmistakably clearer than before. She did not argue. She did not accuse. She simply described what she had been experiencing, and in doing so she introduced a perspective that shifted attention away from authority and toward impact. The room responded differently this time, not with silence alone, but with internal acknowledgement that something had been normalized for too long without being examined. Jasmine listened carefully, then added nothing dramatic, only continued to clarify what she had already begun to expose. That moments like this did not exist in isolation, but were part of a repeated pattern that many people learn to ignore in order to remain comfortable. The phrase itself was not loud, but its implications spread across the room, making several guests shift their attention downward, as if reconsidering their own presence in the situation. Richard looked briefly around, noticing for the first time that his usual indicators of control were not responding. The staff did not react to his subtle cues, the guests were not aligning with his tone, and even the manager hesitated at the edge of the room, as if unsure whether intervention would restore order or make the imbalance more visible. Claire turned slightly toward Jasmine again, and this time her expression carried something more defined than uncertainty. It carried recognition, not of Jasmine as an individual only, but of the space she was occupying in the moment, a space that had previously been invisible in conversations like this. Jasmine acknowledged that recognition without words, simply by maintaining eye contact briefly before allowing silence to continue. And that silence now felt different, not imposed, but chosen. Richard attempted to reclaim attention by raising his voice slightly, but the reaction he received was no longer immediate compliance. Instead, there was delay, hesitation, a collective awareness that reacting to him alone no longer defined the direction of the moment. Claire's attention remained forward now, no longer shifting between voices, and in that stillness she appeared to be arriving at a conclusion internally that she had not yet spoken aloud. Jasmine remained steady, neither escalating nor retreating, but fully present in a way that made avoidance impossible, and the room, once structured around hierarchy and expectation, now existed in a fragile state of reevaluation where nothing had been resolved yet, but everything had already begun to change in how it was being seen. The silence that followed no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like conclusion forming in real time, as if the room itself had reached a point where returning to what it used to be was no longer possible. Richard Hale stood near the table, without speaking for several seconds, his gaze moving across faces that no longer responded to him in the way they once had, not out of defiance in the traditional sense, but out of something quieter and more permanent, a shift in perception that could not be reversed by tone or presence alone. Claire Hale remained seated, her hands now resting away from her stomach, her posture steady, and in her eyes there was no longer confusion, but a growing awareness that she was no longer simply part of an interaction, but part of a pattern she had not previously named. Jasmine Carter did not move, did not interrupt the silence, because at this point silence itself had become the most honest form of communication in the room. Richard finally spoke again, but his voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier in the evening. He attempted to return to structure by referencing professionalism and the importance of context. Yet even as he spoke, it became clear that the language of authority no longer aligned with the emotional reality of those listening. Claire turned toward him slowly, and when she spoke her voice was calm, but no longer deferential. She did not challenge him directly. She described what she had experienced as a continuous pattern rather than an isolated moment, and in doing so she removed the ability to framed the evening as a misunderstanding. Jasmine added nothing immediately, allowing Claire's words to settle fully. And in that pause, the room collectively registered something that had not been acknowledged before, that silence had been functioning as participation rather than neutrality. Richard's expression tightened slightly as he realized that attempts to reassert control through volume or structure were no longer producing alignment. Instead, they were producing observation. People were no longer reacting. They were evaluating. And that distinction changed everything about the dynamic in the space. A guest near the center of the room shifted uncomfortably, not because they were involved directly, but because they recognized how easily silence can become agreement when no one questions it. Claire continued, now more grounded in her words, no longer speaking from within the situation but about it. And as she did, the emotional weight of the evening began to redistribute across the room, no longer concentrated at one table, but shared among everyone present. Jasmine finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, but her words carried clarity that felt final in structure rather than emotional intensity. She did not escalate the situation. She named what had already been visible. That power without reflection often relies on the absence of interruption, and interruption does not always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as awareness. Richard attempted once more to speak, but this time even his silence between phrases felt uncertain, as if he was measuring not just what to say, but whether what he said would still define the room. Claire looked at Jasmine again, and this time there was no hesitation in her expression, only recognition of what had already shifted internally, not because someone had forced it, but because it had become impossible to ignore. The manager at the edge of the room remained frozen between action and hesitation, realizing that intervention was no longer about restoring order, but about acknowledging that order had already changed. Jasmine remained steady, and in her stillness the room understood something without it being spoken, that the moment they were experiencing was no longer about who held authority, but about what everyone was finally willing to see. And in that realization, the evening crossed a threshold that could not be reversed, because nothing that had been revealed could return to being unseen. The room no longer felt like it belonged to anyone in particular, not to the guests, not to the staff, and certainly no longer to the man who had once believed his presence alone could define its boundaries. Richard Hale stood in the same space he had occupied all evening, yet the meaning of that space had changed completely around him. What used to respond to his authority now responded to something quieter but far more absolute. Understanding. Claire Hale remained seated, but her stillness was no longer passive. It was reflective, as if she was finally observing her own life from a distance that allowed clarity instead of pressure. Her expression carried no shock anymore, only recognition that what she had normalized for too long had been visible to others all along. Jasmine Carter remained steady at the edge of the central space, not advancing, not retreating, but present in a way that no longer allowed her to be reduced to a role or label. Richard attempted once more to stabilize the situation through language, but even his voice had begun to lose its natural command. He referenced control, reputation, and misunderstanding, yet each word sounded increasingly disconnected from the emotional reality in the room, because the room was no longer reacting to narrative framing. It was reacting to awareness that could not be reversed. Claire finally spoke again, her voice calm, but no longer uncertain. She did not defend or accuse. She simply described what she now understood, that what had been unfolding was not an isolated moment, but a pattern that had existed long before this evening. And in saying that she removed the final illusion of singularity from the situation, it was no longer about one interaction. It was about continuity. Jasmine listened, and then added nothing dramatic, only reinforcing what had already become clear, that silence in rooms like this does not remain neutral. It accumulates meaning until it becomes participation, and once participation is recognized, it cannot return to innocence. Richard looked around the room again, this time not as a man assessing control, but as someone realizing control was no longer the correct metric. The guests were no longer mirroring his reactions. They were observing each other, processing, recalibrating their understanding of what they had witnessed. Even the manager near the edge of the room remained still, no longer attempting to step forward, because the structure he was meant to enforce no longer aligned with the reality in front of him. Claire slowly pushed her chair back slightly, not in departure, but in separation, as if she was marking the beginning of a mental distance she had not allowed herself before. Jasmine's gaze briefly met hers again, and in that exchange there was no instruction, no hierarchy, only acknowledgement between two people who now understood the same shift from different positions. Richard finally lowered his voice, but this time the reduction in volume did not restore authority, it only highlighted its absence, because authority without recognition had lost its function in that space. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was conclusive, not because everything had been resolved, but because everything had been seen, and once something is fully seen, it cannot return to being ignored in the same way again. The evening did not end with resolution. It ended with awareness settling into every person present, and that awareness would continue long after the room emptied. Because what had shifted there was not behavior, it was perception, and perception, once changed, does not go back. The silence that had filled the room earlier no longer felt like tension. It now felt like aftermath, the kind that arrives after something irreversible has already been understood by everyone present. Richard Hale remained standing near the center table, but his posture had changed in a way that was subtle yet undeniable, not broken, not defeated, but no longer absolute. Claire Hale stayed seated for several seconds longer than necessary, as if confirming to herself that the moment had truly passed into reality and was no longer something she was imagining or enduring. Then slowly she adjusted her position, not toward anyone, but away from the emotional weight that had defined the evening. Jasmine Carter remained where she had been, steady and composed, her presence no longer disruptive because the disruption had already completed its work. It had revealed what was previously unspoken. Richard finally broke the silence, but his voice did not carry the certainty it once had. It was controlled, measured, almost careful, as if each word was being tested against a reality that no longer responded to authority alone. He spoke briefly, not to reassert dominance, but to attempt closure. Yet even in that attempt there was hesitation, because closure requires shared acceptance, and acceptance was no longer unified in that space. Claire looked at him, and when she spoke, it was not with anger or confrontation, but with clarity that had been absent earlier in the evening. She acknowledged what had been revealed, not as an isolated incident, but as a pattern that had shaped more than just this moment, and in doing so she removed the final illusion that the situation could be reduced to misunderstanding. Jasmine did not interrupt. She simply allowed that acknowledgement to settle, because she understood that realization carries more weight when it is not immediately shaped by another voice. The guests remained quiet, no longer reacting, but processing, as if each of them was privately reconstructing their understanding of what they had witnessed. Richard glanced around once more, but this time there was no expectation of alignment, only recognition. That alignment was no longer guaranteed. The manager at the edge of the room did not step forward, because there was nothing left to restore in terms of structure that had not already been mentally dismantled. Claire slowly stood from her seat, not dramatically, but deliberately, and in that simple movement there was a clear separation between what she had been part of and what she was now choosing to observe from a distance. Jasmine met her eyes briefly, and in that moment there was no hierarchy, no instruction, only mutual acknowledgement of understanding reached from different paths. Richard exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in resignation to the fact that control had shifted from presence to perception, and perception could not be commanded, it could only be recognized. The room itself felt different now, not because anything new had happened, but because everything that had been hidden in plain sight had finally been seen, and once something is fully seen, it cannot return to invisibility in the same way again. Claire took a small step away from the table, not leaving the room physically, but signaling the end of her participation in the dynamic that had defined it. Jasmine remained still, no longer as an interrupter of silence, but as the reason it had meaning in the first place, and Richard, for the first time that evening, did not speak immediately after silence fell, because he understood that the silence was no longer waiting for him to fill it. It was concluding without him, and in that conclusion, nothing was louder than what everyone had finally understood without needing it to be said again.